why is building food drive in your dog so massively critical? So we already talked a little bit about the fact that if we have more motivation on the positive side, then ultimately we can use less on the negative side. Now, of course, it's not that we're going to use zero negative motivation, but ultimately the times when we need to be using that should be pretty few and far between if our positive motivators are up nice and high. So we got to look at why we're using food in particular. So fundamentally, I like using food because there's only a couple of things you can really use to motivate a dog on the positive realm. Those being food, toys, praise, treats, so on and so forth. It's pretty simple. There's not a lot of different things that you can use. But fundamentally, we got to figure out, okay, well, what can we use with every single dog, right? Because every dog that I work with is going to be a little bit different. But what are some of the things that carry through with every single breed within, the different temperaments and so on? And ultimately, every dog needs to eat, okay? So if you've got a dog who doesn't like playing with a tennis ball, and you take that ball and you say, well, fine, I'm not letting you play with it for 8 hours. It's not going to develop more desire for that tennis ball. However, if you utilize food in a fashion where your dog is actually working for its food and it decides, hey, I'm not interested in working for my food, and you say, okay, fine, well, we're going to put it away. You're going to get hungry, and ultimately we're going to have you work for your food in that context. We can use that with every single dog. Every dog has to eat, so we can use food. The reason we're not using treats moving forward is because treats ultimately, they look good short term, but they're not great long term. So if you take your dog to the park and you're feeding them treats and they take a few, and then ultimately they decide, okay, well, hey, we don't need the treats anymore. I know that mom's gonna feed me when I go home. I can blow off the treats. It's not gonna develop the level of positive motivation that we want. So we're gonna use our dog's food. And if they say no to the food, we're just gonna say, all right, fine, food's gone. We're gonna try again on our next scheduled lesson. It's not about depriving your dog of food. It's about using it strategically, okay? So we gotta build up our dog's desire for food, and we gotta also look at how much we're feeding, what type of food we're feeding, and the context in which we're feeding it. So let's talk about how much we're feeding. Now, my dogs get a lot more exercise than your typical dog. Okay, I feed my dogs about 3, maybe 3.5 cups of food a day. And on the back of the dog food bag, it tells me to be giving my dog about 4 cups of food a day. Now, my dogs get a lot of exercise, so there's a lot of calories being expended on a normal day, and yet they actually get about, a half a cup less than what it says on the back of the bag. Now, I'm not saying that it's wrong to be feeding your dog what it says on the back of the bag, but I truly believe that for a lot of dogs, it's excessive. It's just not needed. For some dogs, they just don't need that many calories going in because they're not expending a lot of calories. Some dogs are just really, really efficient in how they metabolize food, and they just don't need a lot of food. So you might want to look at how much you're feeding your dog. If your dog is constantly leaving food in its bowl, look at that moving forward, because realistically, a lot of dogs that come in for training with me, they won't eat in the morning. They'll only eat in the evening. Well, that's a pretty good indication that your dog has too much access to food, and it's not doing anything for it, so it's just ultimately become a little bit blah. They're not too interested anymore because they always have access to it, and there's just too much of it available, okay? So that's a little bit about how much to be feeding. The type of food that you're feeding is really critical. If you're feeding a normal dry dog food, okay, depending on what type of food that is, there's going to be 42 to 50% carbohydrates, which essentially means that you're going to be feeding your dog food that they will metabolize as sugar. They'll process it as sugar between 42 to 50%, depending on what type of food that you're feeding. Now, that's really critical because I'm, very adamant about telling my clients reactivity requires fuel. And if your dog has all this extra fuel that is processing as sugars, then ultimately it's no different than a kid who's just being given a bunch of sugar for breakfast every morning, and it's hard for them to learn and it's hard for them to behave, okay? So the type of food that you're feeding your dog is really critical. I'm oftentimes telling my clients to be putting other types of food in with their food as they're doing training or after the rehabilitation process for maintenance and so on, because the more foods that they're going to be eating that are not, heavily laden in sugar as far as how your dog will metabolize them is massively critical. So I give my dogs some normal kibbles, but I also give them all kinds of great stuff, raw meat and organ meats and different types of proteins. I give them fish, I give them fruits and vegetables. I give them all kinds of different things just to give some variety to the diet. And ultimately, the more of that I give them, then ultimately the less sugar they're getting, which is great, because most dogs don't need that amount of sugars or that amount of carbohydrates. And again, their bodies will process it as sugars, okay? We've looked a little bit about what we're feeding, how much we're feeding and what we're feeding, okay? You want to stay away from the dog food bags that are like just heavily laden with carbohydrates. That's a big game changer, okay? And we also got to figure out, where are we feeding the dog, okay? Where you feed your dog is massively critical. If you feed your dog on a dish in your kitchen, it's really not going to get you a whole lot. You're just going to develop desire towards a dog dish in the kitchen and expectations that that's how your dog is going to be fed. You're losing so much potential motivation from your dog by just feeding them that way. Now, I'm not suggesting you should have to feed your dog for going for a walk or for being attentive to you or something like that for the rest of its life. That's not what I'm suggesting. We can use intermittent reinforcement. We can do all kinds of different things to be able to extend the training process so that we don't always have to be bribing our dog with every single, time we ask for their attention. But in the beginning, how awesome would it be for our dog to go out and to be hunting for our pocket? So this is one thing I talk about a lot. Hunt for my pocket. Most dogs walk outside and they're reactive towards other dogs and they're constantly scanning, looking for other dogs, okay? Now they're hunting for other dogs so that they can get really frustrated and they can feel that chemical response, the dopamine addiction, as I call it. And ultimately, I want them to be focusing on me. I want them to be looking up at me. Hey, Dad, you got food? Oh, this is great. If you go for a walk with me and I have one piece of dog food, whether it's a tree or a piece of dog food in my pocket, you're gonna find that I'm just falling over, tripping over my dogs because they're so focused on, hey, I wonder if I'm gonna be able to get that one piece of food, okay? So when you build that level of engagement with your dog, it's gonna take your dog to a completely different level. You can build that motivation as much as you want by just putting a dog dish down for your dog, but you're not utilizing a massive level of motivation that you could be using. This, for my clients, is always a game changer, regardless of whether the dog has a low or a moderate or a high level of food drive. Once the dog understands I get food in a specific context and this is what I have to do for it, your dog changes. Everything changes about your dog in the way that they look at the world, okay? I can't express how important it is to look at how much you're feeding, what you're feeding, and where you're feeding.